So my name is Howson. Cybersecurity is my passion. Been here for about 15 plus years. I've been a consultant, penetration tester, network security, blue team, bunch of different fields and different things. More recently, been doing some talks, and I got a few of them up here. Connecting the dots, which was one of my first ever talks back in 2018, 2019, and then 2020. We'll also have a little bit of overlap in some of these, but this talk's going to be different than some of my other ones. A little less technical, a little bit more on getting over what I'm going to call the writer's block that we run into as security operations. All right, so when we talk about security operations, there's a number of things that we run into, and I wish I had the image up here, but the one about everything's on fire. We have alert fatigue, we have lack of context. Our incident response has, we're not seeing the full thing. We're blocking domains and not, dealing with the malware on the box that wasn't detected. And we're not able to connect these dots very, very well at all. And so these are sort of the challenges that security operations are dealing with day in and day out. And, as you start looking at this, I have some stats for you on the next slide. Some security operations centers in 2018 were reporting over 10,000 alerts per day. That's insane. There's no way to keep up with that. And so the more and more I gave these talks, the more and more times we had this conversation with different organizations, we ran into this conversation of all these things that we're doing is cool, the threat actor profiling, the connecting the dots, some of the threat intelligence stuff we'll talk to you a little bit later, but we don't have time, or we don't know where to start, or how we're going to do this. And I think that comes from this over excess of alerts and in some ways, legacy view of how we view security operations and security alerting. For example, these are some of the traditional alerts that you'll see from a SIM. High IPS, high severity event. What does that tell us, right? Do we need to investigate those? And if that's like 5,000 times in a day, what does that really do for us from a security operations perspective, or even as an investigation perspective? So when you start looking at all these types of default alerts that we see out there, we start seeing that they don't provide that context. They're going to fire thousands and thousands of times, and we're spending our hours sort of spinning our wheels and not really focusing on, those alerts or the things that will actually help our security operations team. So as we go through this, we're going to talk about those things that are more like the, writer's block. Because we're always on fire, we're always, we have 10,000 alerts to deal with. When I go and do these threat actor profiling and connecting the dots, we get in that same sort of cycle. We can't do that. We don't have the tools to do that. So hopefully as we go through here, that'll make this a little bit easier. Then this great thing came out called threat intelligence, and it was supposed to help the problem, right? So threat intelligence came along, said, hey, we're going to tell you what's bad in your network, all these other attacks that people are seeing. It's supposed to help us tell us who's attacking us and how. But what ended up happening is we got the more data that we're ingesting, and what ends up happening is we start seeing screens like this. So when we look at this, we have 15 million new indicators in a 90-day period. We have 112,000 sources, or 112, different sources, and over 102 million total matches. So now we've got 10,000 alerts a day, and now 102 million matches of threat intelligence. What does that mean to our organization? How are we supposed to handle this? Did we actually do anything better with threat intelligence, or are we just adding to the problem? Right? So here's like the fun little Jackie Chan, like, what? We bought all this threat intelligence, we bought all these tools, but we didn't really solve any problems. So as we keep going through this and going through security operations, hopefully by the end of this talk, we'll start talking about, how we can sort of pivot sort of the mindset or how we think about security operations to sort of answer these questions, where we're not looking at 10,000 alerts a day and we're not looking at 102 million matches and going, what are we supposed to do with this? What does this mean to my organization? How do we make this a little bit more relatable? All right, so lovely things here, and we'll sort of go into some modeling. All right, so with all this information overload, now on top of that, we get these things called like attack modeling or threat models or whatever else you want to call them. We have the cyber kill chain on the right and the diamond model on the left. These are really great tools. Both of them are excellent for different things that we can use them for. But once again, we've added more data and we've added more things to do. But how does this relate to what we're seeing in our SIM? How do we know that this domain match is part of this, side of the kill chain, or that this infrastructure is part of this actor, when we don't have any of these things sort of tying together. So now we have all this data and we're learning on everything, but we're kind of sitting there going like, so I get this C2 alert, I see these DGAs, I see all these things, but I really don't know if that means it's a real C2. Did I match the behavior to it? Now I'm going to investigate it. They're going to take all this data and then somehow fit in these models to try to discover what actors are doing, right? And so we start going through this over and over again, and you start getting this sort of hamster wheel where we're kind of chasing ourselves around. We're never getting caught up. We're getting burnt out, and everybody's going like, we can't do anything more. Threat intelligence, sucks. We don't have a way to do it. All we have is another feed. So one of my other talks that I did in partnership with one of our sponsors here, Ion and Anomaly, talks about how we tag intelligence, and we'll kind of go through a very brief moment of that, but how we start trying to connect these dots and building these frameworks. So the next one here, this is going to be a little bit interesting. So we're going to take something. My background is in networking. My schooling was. So we're going to talk about a little bit about networking, a little bit about the cyber kill chain, and kind of merge the two together to sort of build an investigation alert framework. So you start mapping out these attacks. So from a network perspective, if people aren't familiar, the Osi model here on the left talks to how a packet or how data goes back and forth between a computer. And the really key point is these arrows on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, they go down and up. And if we take a look at this model and we see how this sort of works and saying like, hey, you can't have a data link layer without having a physical layer. And you can't have a network layer without a data link layer. And we start mapping that out. And then, I chose the cyber kill chain. I call it the attacker lifecycle cyber kill chain. But you can use whatever you want. And sort of, instead of taking, let's say, like Lockheed or the Diamond model to say, this is what the cyber kill chain is, we took this model because it had 7 layers, and so did the OSI model. Kind of worked out for me on that side of the fence. And started mapping out what this meant to our organization, right? So when you say like reconnaissance, and on the top here, I've noticed just as we're doing this talk, I have SMB twice. But we look at this, say like reconnaissance. So who's scanning your network? Who's port scanning you? Who's doing SMB scans? What are we looking for the reconnaissance layer? What would that mean from my network, right? From a weaponization layer, we look at vulnerability scanning, right? So we look at, hey, who's scanning? Because again, it's starting to build the exploits. I can't watch somebody at their home write the CVE or write the exploit code, but I can sure see on my IPS signatures and how many signatures they're hitting, what they're looking for, what they're trying to do on my network. And as we go down, it goes different ways. So again, from an external perspective, you're going to see things like reconnaissance, weaponization, and exploitation in sort of a row. You won't necessarily see delivery. Whoops, sorry guys, hit my mouse button there. So what you'll see is you'll see reconnaissance, you'll see weaponizations, vulnerability scans, and then you'll go right into like exploitation, where people are hitting CVEs on your network and your IPS rules. But you just have guys that are scanning your network for 1 CVE or 1 vulnerability, and then you have other guys that are scanning 20 of them, which is more like the vulnerability scan, more of send as many packets in as I can. Hopefully I'll find one of their systems that are vulnerable to this. And let's hope my IPS doesn't block that. Right? So if you look at it from that perspective, now we start mapping this out, right? So saying like, hey, so if I see somebody scan my web servers and then they go away, and I had this in one of my other presentations, but then, sure enough, was it last week, WebLogic had a new remote code execution bug. Sure enough, they have this here. Well, what happens when I see somebody come back and that's all they start trying to target? Well, I've already seen them do the reconnaissance, and now I see them sort of escalate to that exploitation phase because they already know what they're looking for, and they're just looking for that code execution, that vulnerability in my network. And so you can see in some of our rules on one of my other presentations, we have rules that say threat actor escalation rules, which just say see guys going from recon to recon to exploitation, or weaponization to delivery, or whatever you might see in those different payloads there. But you sort of see them moving down that payload because I know that they're not going to necessarily just break into my network, especially not the advanced attackers. Nobody's just going to come in one day and say, I know where your WebLogic is, and I'm going to hit you here. There had to be something there. And whether it's the same IP, the same ASN, the same type of activity, usually you can start building out these infrastructures. That's a different talk that I give, but we can go into that a little bit further. On the other side of the fence, from an internal perspective, we started looking at things like delivery, installation, C2, and action objectives. And the reason that we sort of skip over exploitation is because if we can actually detect exploitation and stop it, we wouldn't be here today because we wouldn't have malware installed or anything else, right? So what we usually do, and sort of in one of my other talks as well, is we go from delivery, installation, C2, and once we find that installation or that memory or that malware that was dropped, then we can sandbox it and find the exploitation method. But from a alerting perspective, you're not going to see it, right? Also in exploitation, you'll see the cred stuffing, where people get, the pastor sprays the cred stuffing attacks against you. And in the same model, if I have an alert at C2, I know that in order to have C2 on my network, something, whether in memory or on my computer, had to be installed. If something was installed on my computer, it had to get there. So now I have delivery. So from a security operations perspective, especially when you're trying to go to a level 1 or someone maybe with not as much experience, I'd say this is how you investigate. And remember, we didn't see the full breadth of the attack. We'll go into this a little bit later when we show some sample alerts, is that if you see an alert at C2, you now know that you have to look for an installation and delivery. Same way that you see in action objectives. You see somebody running the command net group domain admins, well, guess what? That person might have C2 on your network that had to be installed and then had to be delivered, right? So all those different phases had to happen for action objectives to occur. This is sort of the framework of starting to investigate it. And not at an organization-wide level, but even at a host-by-host level, just like in the Osi model, right? So on each computer, you can walk through each one of these phases. All right. Now we get to the fun part of how do we know if we're alerting on the right things, right? So talking back to that mindset we're trying to talk about today is if we're trying to figure out, as per this kill chain and everything else, where my alerts sit, we need to first assess from the model what we're saying we're seeing and where do our alerts map out. And so we can start going through our alerts, and they don't have to be named whatever else, but you can start grabbing which logs, which sources, and which types of activity is really important to you. For example, if I'm at, let's say where I'm at today in Air Canada, we're not really concerned about ICS or Modbus or things like that. But in one of my previous roles, Modbus was a very important thing. When people scanned it, that was something that was very important to us. So depending on your reconnaissance, what is matters to your organization, you start walking through and mapping out all your rules, what are the log sources in a very simple spreadsheet, and you start seeing what you're tagging or what you're not tagging, and actually write the rules and identify those gaps. Whether it be that you're missing packet captures, maybe you don't even have the logs. Well, that's great, but that's a huge chunk of visibility that you can start focusing on now because you've mapped it out. Just more examples of this. For example, we have this one here, installation, logs and packets. This one here is specific to, let's say, ransomware. We have nothing here because we don't have those logs, or we don't have anything here because maybe we don't have packet captures. Maybe we don't have this. This is how you start mapping out where you're trying to find in your network those alerts may or may not fire. And sort of the diagram. So once you do this, and once you go start doing this a little bit more, we can start seeing from here, we can actually start mapping or renaming our alerts to exactly that kill chain model, or attacker lifecycle, or whatever you want to call it. We start looking at where our alerts are actually firing. So we're at delivery, great. Microsoft Office Managed PowerShell, well, if that happens, we're probably going to look for installation after. If we have virus from removable media, and I know it's on there twice, we're going to start looking for who plugged in that USB, what is the serial number, et cetera, from maybe a sysmon log. And then the URL, we can sort of sandbox and go from there. Same sort of thing from the C2 level. We have beaconing, firewall detections, whatever it may be there. All right. How does this start to look when you put it together? So when you start taking this together and start mapping this out, you can actually start taking your alerts. And I know it's hard to see, and I see some comments about glasses and seeing on there. Some of that's on purpose, some of that's not. But you actually see that we have, let's say, a kill chain phase, and we have a MITRE technique that are mapped to all of these. So I didn't want to go into too much about how we did the MITRE and cyber kill chain mapping. Do that in a different sort of talk that I give. But when we start listing these alerts off and where we're seeing the stuff, we can actually start seeing, like on the bottom here, an actual phase of where all of our alerts are firing. As you see, we see exploitation, credential attacks, maybe logging in from IOCs, or we see like a lot of C2 and beaconing type activity. What could be causing that? And there's a bunch of different causes and things like that. But you see, well, if these are our two major ones, this is really small. Our smallest one is action objectives or EDR alerts. That's a good thing, right? You want to see less down here and more at the beginning stages of this attack cycle. But again, 193 at C2 is a little bit high. What does that mean? Okay, let's go take a look at that. Maybe it's illegal streaming media. Maybe it's crypto mining. What other factors can we look? And depending on these alerts, you'll actually see what they are. But as I said, as you start mapping this out, this gives you a very clear view of exactly where you're trying to go, what you're trying to see, and sort of, sort of that holistic view of, okay, where am I seeing all of my alerts? If you're seeing 1,000 alerts at installation, but you're not doing anything about them, why are you seeing so much malware, right? If you're seeing that much malware, what email filter, what web filter, what other things are being bypassed so you see all that malware on your computer? Are people just running around with USB drives? These are the questions that you can start answering for your security operations, for your management, and even higher on why or where you're seeing most of your alerts. Everybody has local admin, so everybody installs malware. Great. But at least I can now use this to write that story. All right. So that's sort of the alert stuff, and then we move to some threat intelligence and go from there. I'll answer some questions a little bit there. I see your question there, Rod. I will focus on that in just a second here, but let me go through a little bit more of the talk, and we should have some time at the end there. All right, so from threat intelligence perspective, we do see that there's lots of platforms out there. There's Anomaly, which I know that I'm trying not to focus too many on tools, but there's some that are really good, like Anomaly and others. But there's Recorded Future, TrueStar, Threat Connect. But a lot of times we buy these feeds or these products that say, like Rodney sort of said, hey, all these vendors promise the world, just like that threat intelligence view of 100 million matches of indicators. Is it really providing us what we need, right? If somebody keeps on telling you what they're doing, well, does that mean anything to your organization, or is that not? And we'll go into how we sort of provide feedback into the intelligence loop. But this is how we start building sort of that framework for how we know what we're seeing, and then what we're seeing, and then how we can alert on that. So again, what are the requirements that you need? If we start looking at this, is it just our feeds? Can we tag those same feeds in Recorded Future with the email that sent us malware? What if it's a different malware that we saw than they saw from CrowdStrike? Okay, that's great, but how do I provide that feedback in so I know what they did to me last time, not what they did to the rest of the world, right? And sort of building out this context. And like I said, we do this in another talk. It's down here. It's on demand, so you can watch whenever, and I'll post those links. So we tag. And I don't want to spend a huge time on this, but we'll go over some examples of why and how we tag. So in this one here, this top screen is all sort of the indicators that we start tagging in my network. Though this is recon, because there's 5 of them, it's a little bit harder to do this in the others as you see the other ones come up. But when we start looking at recon, we can start saying like RDP recon sweeps. Well, primarily, other than the US and maybe some shared services, Russia seems to be most interested in there. Whereas web is always going to be US. But SMB sweeps, Vietnam. Well, that's interesting. And DB scans, well, 62% are coming from China-based IPs. Maybe that doesn't tell me who an actor is, but once I start mapping this out, I can start worrying about, let's say, as you see our alerts, well, if China ever has a successful connection into a database, there's something I can do. Why do I know that? Well, they're the ones that are heavily reconning it, so that's where I'm starting to get concerned, right? And we start answering that age-old question of what's hitting us or why, and then we start building out sort of that kill chain or the alerts or the threat intelligence around that. And as we go down, we're going to show some of the different things we tag. So from a vulnerability perspective, you can see we have CVEs, the name of the alert, and the indicators that pop up. We can start seeing delivery. We start seeing emails that have sent us malware, the links, the subject lines, even hashes that have sent us stuff. Now, one thing about the delivery that's very interesting, just like Ken and a few other people talked about, and even Jason Maynard and some of his other talks, we're like, hey, you have all these malware alerts, and it says, oh, well, it blocked it. We're okay. Understanding what you're being hit with is just sometimes as important as what's getting passed. Because how do I know if it gets passed if I haven't done that? So, for example, I will take those emails, and knowing that they sent me a phishing link or malware yesterday, my alert will say, now that I've tagged them, if they send me an email that's successful, alert me. Do you know why? Yesterday, I have proof and I have evidence that these guys sent me malware or a phishing link. So either they were compromised, they're still compromised, but that's how we start building out sort of that list. Same with these hashes. We can start seeing hashes, installation, some action objectives, report numbers or the names of the files, and then even behaviors that they're starting to do. And in future talk, we can actually map this out to MITRE automatically, but that's more my SOAR talk that I'm building for later on this year. But you sort of start seeing how we start tagging these over and over again, and we start to build these patterns, right? From these same files, we can now automatically tag all the C2 domains. And you see the confidence levels associated, the documents and the hashes associated. And so as you start mapping that out, we start getting into these very pretty sort of graphical ways to represent these attacks and start seeing the overlapping indicators, right? And then again, what I'm seeing. So if I'm seeing a bunch of emotet at my borders, when I start looking at what alerts are firing in my network or what should I have in there, guess what's important? Do I have rules that would detect if emotet landed on a computer? Yes or no? Do we know this? I don't know, but let's go see that. Let's go see what emotet ran. Let's sandbox it. Let's go look at our threat intelligence tools, and let's go back to that whole thing where we mapped out our cyber kill chain and our alerts and our intelligence and everything there and see, can I actually do or see this? Am I looking at this? Do I know that they're sending me this? And if we don't have rules that are watching what's getting blocked in our mail filters, what's getting caught in our antivirus, what's being caught in our proxies going outbound for downloading malware, if we're missing all that data, how do we know what might actually make it through? So that's sort of how we're going with this. And then we'll go into how do we do this? All right. So this is sort of where we get a little bit technical, a little bit more detailed, and we'll actually show some examples of actually how to start doing this. We already have most of the data in our SIM, okay? And the ones that we don't have, we can add, or at least we can identify as a gap. Let's say you don't have antivirus logs, right? Or you don't have sysmon on your computers yet. That is a finding that you can do in that mapping exercise we had previously. But at least now we have this here. So you don't need a SOAR. We don't need to say that, hey, Kyle does all this cool stuff, or we know these cool things that this company does over here. We can actually start today with all the information you currently have in your system. Any SIM can do this. It can write a CSV file, and we can start today. Look at your firewalls, emails, AD, EDR logs. So at the bottom, we're going to use this example of an RDP server suite. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at all the different source IPs that are not internal, that are scanning for port 3389 and are greater than 800 unique systems, unique destination IPs. So what does that tell you? Somebody on your border has actually hit a firewall or an address range in your network, and they've tried to get to 3389 over 800 different IP addresses. That's reconnaissance activity, right? For you, it might be 500. Your company might be smaller, it could be 100, but you can play at that number for 800, 1200, whatever it may be, and gather that list, right? Once you have sort of this list, you start getting, and this is actually live, so you can see the exact same rule right up here, grabbing sort of those indicators and that list of different computers that they're scanning. Lo and behold, if you look at this here, there's Russia as one of the top IPs. If we go back to the recon tab, we had a couple tabs back there, a couple slides back. Who is more sister than RDP? Oh yeah, is the Russian-based IPs, and we have 2 of them in the top 3. So then we started seeing all these IPs, and then we go, okay, well now what do we do with them? I do apologize that I'm going to use a commercial tool in the demo. There are MISP and some open source tools that are getting there, but having something like Anomaly or a Threat Connect or something type of a tip like that will really help you start mapping this out. But we take that intelligence and we export that to a CSV. It's that simple of just grabbing lists of IPs, and then you can manually copy and paste that into whatever platform you have, MISP, or whatever else, and apply your tags. So if you see at the bottom here, reconnaissance and RDP suite. Yes, this is going to be manual. If you don't have a SOAR, you don't have some scripts. In our next iteration of this, so this is the first iteration of threat intelligence tagging. In the next one, we'll go into how we can semi-automate it and then fully automate it. But as you start going through this is how you start building out those rules of what hits there. As I said, I'll answer some questions, but yeah, using proxies is very, very interesting, and we can actually start mapping that out as well. I know if we have time at the end, I'll actually show how we've done that. All right, so the second iteration. All right, so now we want to automate this a little bit more, because getting emails from your SIM or, you know, let's say going into a tool or MISP and doing that automatically can be time consuming, I will admit, but again, the value is there. So what we can do is you can take your SIM, send an email or an SFTP of this CSV file. Same exact thing, but I've already got sort of the I type, which is an anomaly thing, the tags that I want to put on it, and the values. You upload it to a computer. So for the first little part of this, when I first got here, we didn't have a store platform. We didn't have this. So what we did is we just emailed an inbox every day, and we had like 12 different emails. You put the CSV files in a specific folder, run Python this script, and then upload up to our tip platform, and suddenly we were able to tag all these different things. So you can do this. You don't need a store. You do. At one of my previous roles, we even had this SFTP off to a Unix server. Unix server would run that Python script on a cron job. After it was done, it would delete the files, and this went out every single day. Kind of like your formats or what Source is doing right now, but make it a little bit prettier to look like. All right, and then the third iteration of the fully automated, you can make pretty little playbooks like this one and make them very modular, where you can start doing the SSH, RDP, web server, database, and SMB. And as you can see, they just go in and run. So as you start doing this, there's definitely different iterations, but you don't have to worry about not having this cool screen right here. We can start doing it right here, or even right here from a file in this, or anomaly, or whatever else, and start tagging all this stuff today, and we don't have to necessarily have too much there. And I mean, that first part of this is actually starting to measure yourself and understanding where your gaps are. And it's okay if you don't have the logs today. It's okay if you don't have them tomorrow. But at least if you know where your gaps are, you can go and say, you know what? I don't get email logs in my SIM, so guess what? I won't be able to see that. Great. Well, if somebody did email you a virus, would your antivirus logs get there? Yes. Perfect. Let's focus on those today. And we'll get a little bit more of this stuff about connecting the dots. All right. So a little bit previous in this, and I know I didn't point it out, we had a malware domain. That was a C2 domain that we had sandboxed. As you can see, we sandboxed it on November 2nd, but on October 13th, it was actually part of a already existing OSNet report, and sure enough, we have an actor associated with it. So even though that domain wasn't used by there, we saw it almost a month later from threat intelligence. We can see the hash that we had, the name of the file. We can see that, hey, it was used by ISC stands on here, and now I have a TA551 actor associated with this, and even a malware document name like BokBot and ICE ID as the type of malware that was being pushed by it. So without even having to analyze it, without having a lot of data, I've now started to connect these dots that start looking like those pretty graphs I was telling you about. And we're doing this automatically today, and like I said, we'll do a store talk in a little while. But here's the hash we saw on our network from this file name. We have a bunch of tags, but we also have 16 MITRE TTPs tagged to this. Oh, and by the way, this domain is also seen by TA551. We saw it from IC Sands, and we see the command and control. So now it's not just that we knew this domain was bad, but now we have all the associated content with it, right? So a lot of, like, as I said, this got flagged in, let's say, our email security and or endpoint. When we found this hash, we sandboxed it. We got all these TTPs associated, all their tags. And by the way, this was the domain it called. Once we went in there, we saw this domain and saw that it was already in our SIM. So the good thing is we knew that C2 hadn't been active in our environment, but we started going like, well, what is this? Did we identify it from our sandbox? What are we going to do? Well, now we have all this other data to connect the dots to go like, well, now I have an actor associated with it. So now we can go, okay, well, what other things does this actor do? Okay, let's start looking at this. Let's start seeing what this other actor does, because maybe there's a malware in C2 that I'm not aware of. Let's go take a look. And that'll build into some of the threat hunting stuff a little bit later. So as you can see, this is actually 2 attacks that happen on the same day. We can see 2 different hashes in here, some overlapping TTPs. And we can actually start mapping out the overlap of those MITRE TTPs from the various pieces of malware. And I see encrypted channels, very red. That means it's overlapping on a lot of the different techniques. Native API, only one of the 2 hashes had that. Okay, only one of the 2 hashes uses removable media. But both of them had process injection. Okay, well now you start seeing how we map this out and start using this in our sort of security operations and going, okay, well, would I have caught this? Do I have rules, or does my EDR see for process injection? Do I have PowerShell scripting So as we click on these, you can actually get more details, but it's not interactive, so I can't do that in my last slideshow here. But now we sort of draw sort of the bigger picture of what's actually hitting our network. And this type of an alert, we're looking for this, gives you 100% more context than my IPS fired a high severity alert, right? Because you kind of sit there like, what would be your next step? Well, was it successful? And it was blocked. Okay, great. But did he do anything else? Well, we don't know, right? But now we start building this up from the back, so from the down on the lower ends of the kill chain and on the higher, and it's sort of meet in the middle. All right. So when we start doing this, the difference between threat hunting and alerting is very, very different, right? Threat hunting is things that you don't necessarily know in your environment, maybe low confidence indicators, whatever else, that have different behaviors. Some of them are, alerting. It's got to be your confidence stuff. I don't want to see a confidence of 40% firing an alert in my sim. So we start grabbing threat intelligence from there, but we start making it very, very tactical and very, very close to what we're looking for. So if you remember on one of those first slides, we had 50 million indicators in 90 days. We only have 346 of those that make it to our sim. Okay, why? Well, we care if it's greater than 90 days old. We don't want to see it because greater than 90 days old isn't really an alertable threat intelligence indicator. Okay, great. Well, on IPs, we might want 90%, but on domains, we might want 50%. Okay, great. Maybe you don't want URLs. Our sim doesn't do that. Why do we have that intel? So we start sort of tuning it down to what really matters from an alert perspective to what we can see. And as we start doing that, now we can actually start matching on those to the behaviors that we see. So if we were to look at this, okay, we have intelligence that matches, we have this. Well, now we can see like a delivery, a technique number, and there's a phishing email match. Great. An email came in and we saw a match and it was delivered, alert fires, right? We can come up here and say, hey, we have a phishing URL. And this is very interesting. See how the matches up here and the matches down here, the same technique? Well, one of them is a phishing email match. One of them is they click the link. This is my proxy log. If they've clicked the link, they've exploited my user. That matters to me. Authentication through IOCs, malware detected, emotet downloaders. So we have specific indicators for looking at emotet, and C2. And as you see, depending on the rule, we have many more rules in different phases, and these are not all of them. I've kind of strategically picked different sections to show in for this. We can see C2 domains that are known C2 domains, known threat detection, et cetera, et cetera. And so as we start matching those up, we can actually start seeing, okay, so if we see a C2 domain, if I see one hit from a C2 domain, does that mean that I have C2? Most sims and most alerts are like, yes. Well, what if that's not really C2? C2 beacons, it calls out more than once, and we see a lot more data around it. Okay, great. So how about we see a C2 domain that fires over 50 times in a 24-hour period? That may be a much more, let's say, context-based rule that it tells us that not only do we match the C2 domain, but we match more than this time. It was allowed or not allowed, and we start looking at what caused that domain, whether it's the browser Chrome or whether it's malware.exe. But matching that intelligence to that alert and the behaviors is really the key point takeaway when we start looking at the threat intelligence and the alert matching. Is if you have the framework and you know where it sits at, now you have the intelligence and the tagging that matches all that, and you combine the two, you can start seeing how everything sort of starts to fit together. And then, as we get past that from a security operations, because everybody's sort of pivoting into threat hunting these days, and I'm looking at my time, so I'll keep on getting near the end here so I can answer some questions. Threat hunting is not the same thing. Threat hunting is looking for those different things in our network that may be high confidence, maybe not high confidence, but what do they find? So yes, this is a vendor tool called Anomaly Match, but allows us to use these indicators in a much different way. And as you can see, there's obvious spikes in intelligence and attacks and different types of attackers, countries that are standing out, and we actually start matching this over time. And I can start matching on actors. I can start matching on TTPs. I can start matching on vulnerabilities, and even news stories and threat bulletins, or even start alerting on them over time. And so as we start going through this, okay, so remember how we said we didn't want intelligence greater than 90 days? That's great, right? Because it's not a good indicator. It's old. Everybody pivots emails, IPs, et cetera, right? But as we start looking at this, we start looking at examples where, hey, we see an APT IP with a confidence of 40 and 320 days old. May not be something we care about. However, we see it try to send an email in from an admin at support.vx.com, and we also see that it says it's a graceful spider, which is a cyber criminal. Interesting. Well, on the same day we got this email, for the first time passive DNS had supportvx.com hosted on its IP. Oh, and look, we also have OneDrive-em.eu.com and a few other OneDrive sort of domains hosted off that same IP around the same sort of time frames that we're seeing. So a couple of days later, and more and more and more. What's an old indicator? It's low confidence, but now I see blocked emails coming in from this sort of same indicator, and I can see that they're blocked. Unfortunately, in my current mail too, I couldn't see the URL or what they're sending, but I can see that it dropped, that it's associated with this actor, and then we're seeing very targeted type of emails. So sort.vx.com or OneDrive are very common phishing type stuff that we see. Maybe this indicator now I tag with all these different things, and now it becomes less than 90 days old. Now it comes up and says, the confidence for me might be 80% because I can see a lot of phishing domains off of it. And now I take this all together, and now I have something I can alert on. And that comes from the threat hunting perspective. So final wrap up. I know that we're 45 minutes here. So when we look at this, it can be manual. But it seems like when we do these sort of conversations, or the ones that the feedback I've got from previous talks is, this is all great over here, but we're over here, and how do we do this? And I call it sort of the writer's block. We constantly sit in the sort of that fire sort of image, this one here, where everybody's sort of seeing this image of we're sitting in fire, we don't have time to do this, and we're trying to fight all these fires, and we're sitting there like, we can't do this today. We can't take our intelligence. We can't see what alerts we're currently firing. We're going to look at these types of things, and we're kind of losing that sort of the battle because we're seeing 10,000 alerts a day. If we went back to that alert one where I showed you how many alerts a day, let's say we see 20 alerts a day, and maybe 4 of them actually make it past, the level of automatic level one triaging. Well, that's 4 alerts a day. That's pretty good to be able to manage, right? And even if you get up to 10 of them, 10, 20, 30 alerts a day is really easy to manage versus 10,000. And with the context that we're seeing it at, the analysts already know what they're going to be able to do. You don't have to sit there and go like, so it said we had an IOC match for WePro, which is one of the other custom alerts that they showed up there. Okay, what does that mean to me? Right? And so we go back and we start looking at this and go, okay, well, now I know it's at the C2 level, that it was a C2 domain, and because my alert says to it, we talked to it greater than 50 times in this. Great. So did anybody type commands on that computer? No. Did we have any malware alerts? Let's go see. Did we have any scheduled tasks? Oh, we did. Well, now we have a way to hunt and use that. Okay, well, how did that scheduled task or how did that, registry entry get edited? Okay, let's go look at our delivery. And it's a structured way for them to look at it. You can do it today. We don't have to sit here and start to buy tools. I know that COVID's there. You don't need to buy brand new tools to start doing this work today. And there's a lot of groundwork to do when you start mapping this out and identifying where your gaps are, whether it be packets, C2, logging. I've been talking to got a lot of consulting friends. They'll sit there and go, hey, half the time they don't even have the logs in their SIM. Well, what logs are they missing? Let's map it out against some tactical lifecycle and focus on those that are priority-wise because of this. And we're all going to start from here. There's going to be challenges. Focus on what you need to do. Focus on what's important. Look at what tools you currently have and use those to the best of your abilities, and then go from there. And that's sort of my final wrap-up, and I know there's a couple questions. I'll jump into some questions, and then if we have time, I'll show one other screenshot in advance, or if people are at CowSec, I might have to cover some things tonight as well for our local meetings. So sorry, I'm just scrolling back up. Rod had a question first. Do you think it's a big miss on vendors that promise us the world and sell us missing value, this and that? Yes and no. I think that our vendors are trying, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we have with a lot of this is that vendors have to go to the lowest common denominator. So for example, if you see EDRs and say, hey, we have the most MITRE matches in the world, and we take every single MITRE technique. That's great, but I don't want to know every time somebody takes net user or scheduled a task. I want to know when a scheduled task gets fired when it goes from a normal user to an elevated user, or this and that, right? So I think that we have to take sort of what the vendors are doing and sort of start adding some intelligence around it from a behavior perspective, and only we know what the behavior is in our network, right? If somebody types net user 5 times from cmd.exe manually within an hour, That there is probably a better indicator than the net user every time. But some companies might say 10, some might say 5, some might say 3 in an hour is enough to alert on. So I think we have to start providing that back into our tools. Another one from Rodney. How do you dynamically manage the math for adjusting confidence? I assume a lot of this is related to specific post anomaly. Yeah. So normally there's private tags and internal tags. And so what we usually do is you can provide a confidence or source confidence level, and then they have a macula algorithm in the back of Anomaly that does some calculations for us. And we kind of go back and forth when we ingest them and say, hey, this is what we want it to be, and this is what it is. However, we also have certain indicators with certain behaviors like credential stuffing. Based on the rules that we see from our SIM, 100% of the time, we know that this is what they're doing. So we don't rely on anybody doing any calculation. We say it's 100%, that's 100%. And that's what it gets tagged as. Nick, what about coordinating work? Yes. So this is actually good, and thank you, Nick. One of my upcoming talks with Ion and Anomaly, we're actually providing a trusted circle, but within Anomaly and other tools, we have a threat sharing circle or a trusted circle where we share this intelligence with others, whether it be an RH ISAC or an aviation ISAC or a health ISAC. You know, there's these great sharing circles, but I find that sometimes it's hard to share. They don't have mechanisms to do it in a very structured way. And the other challenge is that they're sharing intelligence in a way that has no context. There's like, for example, my worst thing is when somebody uploads an IP says bad IP or IP block list. If I see an indicator that says that, you know, those get excluded from my SIM and from my intelligence because that doesn't provide me anything. What do I know that it does? Now I have to go do my own research on abuse IBDB and everything else and go through that. So yes, we do share, but I'm trying to get some structure on how we share, whether it's private or public tags, to help us get a little bit more of that structure, like the attacker life cycle for the kill chain. We can actually start seeing where that sees in our alerts so that everybody provides some level of context around the alerts. Hey, this email, great. Was it malware or cred stuffing or a credential? That's it, right? So I'll go down to Brett here. What is the highest ROI from this prediction that will happen next? Yeah, so with ROI, it's hard with threat intelligence. We've been able to map it out on some of the attacks we saw. So if you see in one of my slides back here where we had sort of the big spike, because we tag, and we know we tag a specific behavior with this actor IP, you can see it overlaps with a spam IP, a bot IP, and a mal IP. This huge spike, because we tag this, can tell us exactly what that behavior was almost instantly, and we don't have to have almost like an investigation. We know what's happening, we know what's going on. So the biggest ROI is really hard because it's hard to measure, but we've been able to predict attacks. So one of the other presentations I was going to bring up, which if I have time with 5 minutes at the end, I'll bring it up, is we're actually able to, based on trending all this data, actually predict threats, when and how they're going to hit us. Favorite Ninja Turtles, Leonardo. Thank you, Tyler. And Rodney, do you exclude them or do you have manual review? A little bit of both. So for my indicators, I auto import them depending on the SOAR rule that I have. Most of them auto import because we rule them out. And there's like good examples where like the vulnerability tags that we have, they'll go in and have a whole bunch of CVEs, and then what'll end up happening is it'll take out Qualys and everything else. That's actually what we're using. Thanks, Rodney. So yeah, so we include and exclude different things. It varies depending on the intelligence, but what we're able to do is start mapping this out. And like I said, even with the mapping of like reconnaissance and who's doing it, the credit stuffing, we're able to do that a little bit easier. And it looks like I haven't got the message yet that I have to stop. So I'll do one quick last thing here. This is a different presentation, but this is part of the one that we're doing with Anomaly and Ion, where we talk about sort of the cool things. So this is where you start getting advanced, and we start talking about Sun Tzu. If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you shouldn't worry about any battle. When we look at this and we start looking at the behaviors, we can actually start mapping this out. For example, we have indicators that are under 90 days that were coming through here, and they were actually hitting us, and you can see that all related to a specific actor on this or a malware family. So this was a TrickBot or Wizard Spider malware family when it's under 90 days, and because of the behavior that we see over and over again, we knew that this was going to happen. So we were able to come in and say we're going to see a credential stuffing attack from primarily Russian-based IPs within the next 4 to 5 days, based on the fact that we can see, whoops, sorry, a second here. There we go. And this is going to be really hard to read, so I'm going to go through it. In January, we saw this do a credential stuff against us. And around May or March timeframe, we saw that they CrowdStrike or another threat intel vendor had tagged this as TrickBot. And the behavior we see it doing over here, and I know it's really hard to read, is they were doing things like missing headers, Firefox and Chrome anomalies, basically user agent things that were not letting it pass our WAF. And when you combine these intel markers and these here, and you see that behavior together, we can make this prediction. And it always happened like a Monday, Tuesday night, and we saw it go happen. And then sure enough, from the indicators that we saw on June 11th, 15 failed logins from the country and indicator botnet that we saw. Sure enough, within 4 days, so on the 15th, 300, and it started spiraling from there and went up for 2 days. So we're actually able to predict how these are happening now because of this framework and because of mapping it all out. We can actually see when and how they're going to hit us. So we can even say, and even my boss hates this when you send him a note saying, in 4 to 5 days, you're going to get hit, right? And you're like, what do you mean? Like, don't worry, we're ahead of it, we're fine. But when you can start telling them how and when you're going to be hit and what's going to happen if they got hit, because we have all these TTPs mapped out, we say, yes, we have all these rules. Yes, we see this. We're ahead of this and we know what's going on. And because of this, we know this is going to happen. We can go from there. And like I said, there's tagging profiles. We're going to have a guidance for tagging and moderated. That will be coming out by, I think, by the end of the month. And so that's it. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Like I said, it's different than more technical, just trying to talk about the mindset and get past there. Thank you for all that. If you have any questions, please message me anytime.